Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon to those of you who are with us in Asia, and a very good morning to those of you who are in Europe with Robert, our speaker for the day. Welcome to the first knowledge building session on what is open education resources, in short also known as OER. First of all, before we have the presentation by Dr. Robert Farrow, some admin notes. During the session, to have a smooth and effective session, please mute yourself so that we don't have any background noises. And there might be some interactive elements by the speaker, so please participate actively as instructed by the speaker. And raise your hand if you have a burning question or comment during the session. Otherwise, please type your questions or comments in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on the chat box so that Robert can also respond to those necessary comments and questions in the chat box. And when you share your comments and questions, please be precise. As we have a 1-hour session, we need to cover content as well as also respond to as many of your questions as possible. And then after the session by Robert, we will have a short question and answer session on open education resources. And then we will tell you what to expect next, and then we'll close the session. So with that, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Robert Farrow, Research Fellow at the Learning and Teaching Innovation from the Institute of Education and Technology, the Open University in the United Kingdom. Robert is very passionate about open education resources and support educators around the world through open education resources. I invite Dr. Robert Farrow to take the floor, introduce himself a bit more, and then lead the session. Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Rob Farrow. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University. I've been doing research in the open education space for about 13 years now. And I'm going to be drawing on some of those experiences to give you an overview of open educational resources, what they might mean for you, how they might empower you in different ways, and understanding what kind of options you get from open educational resources. I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so there should be plenty of time for discussion at the end. I'll be grateful if you put your comments and questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll pick them up at the end if that's okay. So yeah, looking forward to it. Great. So let's proceed. So I've given you a slight bit of background on me already. My background in disciplinary terms is in philosophy. So I studied philosophy before moving into educational technology. And this partly is reflective of my kind of approach to educational technology, which is kind of critical and quite connected to human values. And this comes through in open educational resources, where you can understand OER in terms of its social impact. Let's do it in the chat. Let's do it in the chat. So if you want to just say something about your interest in OER, that would be really helpful. So one thing I'd like you to think about going through this session this morning is, what do you have to share, and how might you share things, share your knowledge, share your insights with other people? I know everyone's an educator, everyone's been a student, and so you have a sense of how educational resources are generated, how they're used. But I ask you to just have a think about what you already produce and what you might have to share with other people. And we're going to talk about some ways in which open educational resources can facilitate that and give you options for that. So have a think about that. What do you have to share? And we'll come back to this idea as we go along. So open educational resources, or OER. I've got a couple of definitions here, the Creative Commons definition and the UNESCO definition. But whichever definition you use, and there are others, they all have the similar kind of structure, which is that they define OER as educational materials that are either in the public domain or licensed in such a way that enables people to do things that they couldn't do with copyrighted resources. And sometimes people talk about the 5 Rs. We'll talk about those shortly. And this is one way to understand the difference between OER and copyrighted resources. And OER can be anything. So they can be any medium, any kind of resource. And the crucial thing is how they're licensed. So they're either in the public domain or they're on an open license that permits different kinds of use. And those forms of use can be, to do with how they're shared and redistributed, as well as how you might use them in the classroom. The journey of open educational resources has, been quite impactful so far. So it's about 20 years ago that the concept was first developed. In 2019, UNESCO adopted a recommendation on OER, which you can see here, these 5 areas of action: building capacity of stakeholders for OER, developing OER supportive policy, encouraging inclusive and equitable OER, nurturing sustainable models for OER, and promoting and reinforcing international cooperation with OER. And this is now offering policy direction at an international level to support the creation and use of open educational resources in all kinds of different contexts. So it's quite a big and significant thing, even if it's a new concept for you. There's all different kinds of ways in which national policies and regional policies and institutional policies are drawing on this kind of direction. And so the value of open educational resources is acknowledged at this sort of very, very high policy level. And you've probably got something going on in your local context which reflects this interest in OER. So you might say, well, why is there interest in OER? Like, what's the point of it? What does it give us? How does it benefit us? So about just over 10 years ago, one of the first projects I worked on in open education was called Open Education Research Hub. And the idea with this project was we were working with a bunch of different organizations all around the world who were already using OER. You can see some of them here. And the goal was really to try and sort of form the first evidence base for open educational resources, because up to that point, a lot of it was about the kind of claims people had made about OER, but there wasn't really a lot of evidence to back that up. So it was an evidence gathering project. And the way that the project was organized was that we had a series of 11 hypotheses, which we were basically trying to find evidence for or against. And so these are the kind of things that people were talking about in terms of the benefits to education and educational stakeholders. So for instance, starting at the top, the idea that it improves the satisfaction of students, or it improves their performance in learning assessments. The idea that people use OER differently because they've got different licenses, that we can include more people in education, that we can help some people who are at risk of not finishing their studies because they don't have access to educational materials, they can be provided with them, and so on. And these work across formal and informal learning scenarios. And this is where the kind of debate was, I guess, around 2011, 2012. When we completed the project, we did find the strongest support for these 2 hypotheses. So the first one being about improving student performance, and then also the reflection hypothesis. So the idea that when educators use OER, they're more likely to reflect on their practice and more likely to innovate the way they teach. And this is something that we found quite strongly. We did find evidence for the others as well, but these are the 2 that I thought were worth picking out today. Another study, this one's from 2016, and you can see here on the right-hand side, the kind of the phrase is hypotheses here as well, but claims that learning and teaching practice is improved through the use of OER. What the evidence base overall shows now is that open educational resources are definitely not worse than proprietary resources. And there's been lots of research done at scale since we did some of this work in 2012. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because in a way, it's how you use the resources that makes the difference. But historically, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, historically, there were concerns about the quality of OER because anyone can make OER. It doesn't have to go through some sort of process to get a license. But the same is true of copyrighted materials, in fact. So where we are now in terms of the benefits, I would say a significant one is around reducing the cost of resources. Often OER are completely free to the end user. There's still a cost in terms of the time to produce them and that kind of thing. But as we'll see later, sometimes if you're doing certain activities already, creating the OER is just a simple add-on. But it may be better to think of them as low cost rather than free, just because of that time implication. How much it matters that educational resources are low cost kind of depends a bit on the context, depends where you are, depends how important the cost of educational materials is where you are. In the United States of America, for instance, textbook costs can be very high indeed. And so there was an instant use case for open educational resources to bring that cost down. In Europe, it's not such a big thing, the cost of textbooks, but tuition is maybe a bigger thing, certainly in the UK. Anyway, so one sort of downstream benefit of lowering the cost is that you can improve access to educational materials. And so you can see this in terms of like a lifelong learning perspective, but you can also see it in terms of social justice and extending educational provision to people who would otherwise be marginalized. You can also understand it in terms of giving people access to the textbook or the resources or whatever from day one, rather than having to wait for instance, a student loan or something to come through so that you can then buy the books. OER means you've got it from the very start of the course. Another use case for OER is around augmenting what's already being offered. So if, for instance, you have a textbook, but it's a little bit out of date and you wanted to add some additional content into there, OER is a way that you can do that. It's also, something that you can use to, for instance, make translations of existing content, assuming that that's OER, of course. So there's new possibilities and innovations around the use of OER. But then what happens a lot of the time is once someone starts using OER, and this is sort of relates back to this idea of educators being more reflective about their practice. When people use OER, they sometimes start to think, what else could I do differently in my classroom? What else could I do differently in my kind of online teaching or whatever it might be? So it seems to have this dimension where it empowers users and empowers people to think more and be more creative about the way they teach and be more innovative in their practice. And again, you can see this sometimes as a social justice kind of thing. There's a lot of people, for instance, doing work around decolonization of educational resources, which I would say is a form of innovation. And maybe more kind of down to earth, kind of like just at the kind of basic level, just using OER opens up all kinds of possibilities for how we share, reuse, and repurpose what already exists. So there's lots of different ways in which people see these benefits, and this is partly why we've got these high-level directives like the UNESCO directive. So using OER, how do people use OER? Well, there's a simple answer to this, right? You can use OER in exactly the same ways as any other educational resources. There's no sort of magic way of using OER. It depends on the OER. It depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on the context. But you can use OER in all the same ways as other educational resources. So in that sense, the answer is pretty simple, right? You just do the things that you would normally do, but this time it's got an open license on it. So what difference does the open license make? Coming back to this idea of the 5 Rs, sometimes this is what people talk about indirectly as the advantage of OERs. So these all relate to copyright. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on copyright shortly. But the 5 Rs are retain. So you can own the content and make copies of it. Copyright doesn't necessarily let you do that. Reuse, use the content in a different context. Revise, change the content. And that could be translation, as we already mentioned. But it could be making tweaks, updating a textbook, that kind of thing. Remix. So this could be taking different forms of content from different places and then putting them together to make something new. And then redistribution. So being able to share freely either the original version of something or your remix or whatever it might be. And I'm going to go into a bit more depth on these in relation to open licenses in a second. But this is what people mean when they talk about the 5 Rs. A bit further downstream from this, you might highlight something like open pedagogy. So the further we go into using OER, you might start to rethink all kinds of things about the classroom. And this is not going to be right for everybody, right? I'm not saying this is like the final destination of OER use has to be open pedagogy. But open pedagogy exists as an example of what you might do with OERs if you were being quite radical, let's say. And so the idea here is to only use open educational resources, but also to make the whole pedagogical process quite transparent and to give people the chance to influence the curriculum, um, to tell you what they want to study, right? Within limits, obviously, but then also creating assignments and creating assessments that encourage learners to create more OER and incorporating those back into the pedagogical process and the planning process. So this is a concept which I think is good to be familiar with. It's not necessarily like everyone should go from doing no OER straight to open pedagogy, but it shows you a line of progression and development that's possible. So to understand OER, you really need to understand how copyright works. And you may have already a decent understanding of copyright. That's great. There are some variations in different countries in terms of how it works. Some of this is a bit technical. And I think it's fair to say you might not get it all the first time, right? And I totally understand that because it is, detailed. So you might have to go back and look over the slides again later, right? Don't be surprised if that's the case. But I wanted to include all of the information around this stuff because it's really quite important. But I won't necessarily read all of the content that's on the slides. I more just wanted you to have a copy of the detail of it. But let me proceed. And then if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat as we go along. Don't forget to be thinking about what you might have to share and how you might share it. So copyright's a relatively recent invention. And actually, until you had the printing press, there was no need for copyright because the only way to copy anything was to find someone who could read and write, which in Europe at least normally meant someone in the church, or someone connected with, aristocracy or something. And you would have to ask them to copy it word for word. Once we had the printing press, obviously, that means you can reproduce things mechanically. And so all of a sudden now it's a bit different because there's a lower barrier to entry to all this stuff. And so it wasn't long before copyright laws or things that looked like copyright laws started to be developed. And there's a short historical sequence here on the slide. By the 20th century, organizations like UNESCO had developed guidelines on universal copyright, so international forms of copyright. And we're still basically living with the 1976 Copyright Act, which codifies a lot of the copyright law of today. It's worth saying that it's not the same in every country, but most countries mutually recognize each other's copyright. And copyright is something that happens automatically when you create something. So you don't have to apply for copyright. It's automatically part of when you create something. You can use your copyright to give someone else a permission. So for instance, if I write a book, I can say to a publisher, you can publish my book, but I'm keeping the copyright. I'm just letting you do something. I don't have to give you the copyright to let you do that. And so that works in lots of different ways. Like you could put a play on, or you could perform a piece of music or whatever. That doesn't change the copyright status, and doesn't affect my rights as the creator of something. And violations of copyright can be civil or criminal. But normally what happens is you get some sort of like takedown notice or something like, a letter from a lawyer or something. But to be honest, I've never actually had anything like that happen to anyone that I've known. But one thing that's important to remember with open licensing is it protects you from copyright violation. So what can be copyrighted? You can only copyright original works. and you can only copyright things that have an expression in physical form. So, for instance, you take a picture of something, you only copyright to the picture, not the thing that you took the picture of. And you can't copyright an idea or a feeling or a thought or anything like that. So you can't have had the idea for something and someone else put it into reality first, and it's like, oh no, you stole my copyright. Copyright only exists when you create the thing. So what happens with things that are copyrighted? Eventually, they go into the public domain. So public domain just means that there are no intellectual property rights on these things anymore. And in the UK and USA, for instance, copyright expires about 70 years after the death of the author. And so their works enter the public domain. And once something's in the public domain, you can do anything you like with it. There are no rights on it anymore from the author. There's no copyright. There are some exceptions. There's this King James Bible translation, which is held in perpetual copyright by the UK Crown, for instance. But this is pretty standard stuff. And it's worth noting as well that the 70 years thing is gradually being increased over the last 50 years or so because of lobbying. It was less than that. Slight aside, but it was people like Disney that were behind a lot of the lobbying. Obviously, they don't want things like Mickey Mouse becoming public domain, but you may have noticed that this year, Steamboat Willie, who was the original Mickey Mouse before he was Mickey Mouse, he's now in the public domain, so you can do what you like with Steamboat Willie. This is William Shakespeare, often considered one of the finest writers in the English language. And basically, all his works are in the public domain, right? He lived a long time ago. You can do whatever you like with a Shakespeare play. In addition, this picture of Shakespeare is also in the public domain. So you can also do what you like with the picture, and you could create something new out of it. You could, turn it into an artwork or whatever, and you wouldn't be violating any sort of copyright by doing that. So things that are of a certain vintage, things that are of a certain age, they're already in the public domain, and you can do what you like with those materials, which is why you don't need permission or anything to put on a Shakespeare play or even to publish a book with the complete works of Shakespeare in. You can do that if you want to. It's in the public domain. So why do we have this 70-year period? The idea is to incentivize people to continue to create intellectual property. And at one level, it's about protecting profits, but also the idea that the author should benefit from the things that they create. But we also have this thing called fair use. And fair use is where you get to talk about or use examples of of copyrighted works, for instance, for educational purposes or for criticism or something like that. So you might have a YouTube channel and you want to talk about the new Star Wars movie or something, and you're doing a review. You can have clips of the Star Wars movie in there while you're talking, and that's considered fair use. A lot of educational applications of copyrighted material are considered to be fair use. But obviously a lot of it also happens kind of below the radar, right? No one really knows what's happening if you're photocopying bits of a textbook or something and sharing it with students, and it's happening in a very kind of subtle way, let's say. But there is a lot of educational use of materials which could be considered beyond fair use. My point here is that open licensing just gives you the sort of basis for things that you want to do without having to rely on the kind of gray area of fair use. So going into open licensing in a bit more detail. So at one end of the scale, you've got copyright, all rights reserved. And at the other end of the scale, you've got public domain, no rights reserved, Shakespeare. And the open licensing options exist somewhere in the middle of this, where some rights are reserved. And depending on the license options that you apply to something, that will determine what people can and can't do with the resources that you create. There's quite a lot of detail on these slides. I don't think it's worth going through everything in all the detail that's on there. This is basically a summary of what I'm going to share in the next few slides. So on the one hand, these licenses exist to try and empower people and say what you can and can't do with people's work. And to do that, the license is made up of different layers, which I'll talk about. And as you'll see, there are different parts to open licenses which can be combined in different ways, and that specifies what you can and can't do with these. So looking at the three layers, and I'm using Creative Commons licenses as my example of open licensing. That's the most popular example. So 3 layers. The first layer is basically the legal stuff, right? The legal code, the legal language, the part that's legally enforceable. And it is very much like lawyer language, right? Not necessarily understandable to the average person. So there's a second layer, which is supposed to be the understandable description of what the license does. And this is what you will most often see if you're looking at a Creative Commons open license description. Everyday language description. And the third part is machine readable. And if you like, it allows the license to be understood by computers, scanned and just kind of processed in that way. And so those 3 things together are what goes up to make up an open license. But then each license has different elements that let you say what people can and can't do with your content. So starting in the top left, attribution. And this is on all of the licenses. And it says, you can use my content, but you have to say that it's my content that you used. So you attribute me as the author of the thing that you used. You'll see this quite a lot. It's also on the first slide of this presentation, you may recall. Moving to the right, share alike, SA. This means that whenever you create a work based on something that I've produced, you have to put the same license on the new thing as the original thing. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. Essentially, it just means that that share alike condition is inherited by anything produced later. Next one down, bottom left, non-commercial. You can use my content, but you can't make any money off it. So for instance, I've written a textbook on physics. You're very welcome to use it, but you can't print new copies and sell them, for instance. And then the last one is no derivatives. And that means you can't adapt the work. You can only reproduce it in its existing form. Bit technical, right? Bit technical. And in a way, it's easier to sort of see real examples. I wanted to show you that you can combine these in different ways, right? And so this is where you get the idea of giving quite specific instructions about what people can and can't do with your content. So you might want to say, for instance, you can do whatever you like. Attribution, that's the most permissive license. It's arguably the most open license, but it means people can pretty much do whatever they like as long as they say, I got it from you. You can add a share alike to that. So that's the second example here. Exactly the same, but you have to license anything new under the same terms. So you can't introduce anything different. It has to be share alike and buy. You can have it with a no derivatives clause. So you can't share any adaptations or derived works. You can combine them and have a non-commercial license. But without a share alike also in there, it means someone could, produce something else based on what you've done and make money off it potentially. So you can combine those 2 things and say, okay, in the 5th example, it's non-commercial share alike. And then finally, you want to allow people to download and share what you've produced, but you don't want them to change them or use them commercially. You would use CC by NC ND. And these license options just take a little bit of time to get used to and to get your head around how the combinations work. So I wouldn't expect you to sort of take it all in one go. The important thing, though, is that through these open licenses, creators get to retain the copyright of what they have produced while allowing others to use them in the ways that they permit. So these are the 5 R's. This is what you can and can't do. How can you share it? Can you use it commercially? And can you remix the content? That's what the open licenses allow you to do. There are also another 2 things that Creative Commons offers, which are not technically licenses, but you might see them used a bit like licenses. And so there's CC0. This allows you to dedicate something directly to the public domain. So rather than using CC BY, you just say, look, it's fine, you can just use it. There's a few online services that have image libraries, for instance, that use this kind of thing. And there's a public domain mark, which can just be used to indicate that there's no copyright restriction on something. So quite a lot of stuff to take in. Most people, they find it takes a little while to understand all of those options properly. Moving on to like what more downstream activities, what can you do with these licenses? Well, you can get into all kinds of remixing scenarios. And these are the kind of, if you like, this is the hard mode of OER, where you're trying to potentially bring together sources from all different places and create new things. Bearing in mind that not all work done with these licenses is education based, right? There's a lot of artists, for instance, using Creative Commons licenses to produce artworks in these kind of ways. But maybe there's two things to be aware of, right? Two options, let's say. One is a collection. So in a collection, you're bringing together a few different things. So for instance, it could be you're going to produce a textbook made from chapters from all different places that are already OER. So you're going to keep everything separate. They're all different chapters. They might have different licenses. And in this case, it's more like the TV dinner example here, where you've got different containers for the different things. Depending on the license, it will determine, what the overall collection is, how that's licensed as well. How you arrange copyrighted works can be copyrightable itself, right? So the collection itself can have a license, which may be different to the materials in it, depending on whether you've got share alike clauses and stuff like that in there. The other example of this would be something like the smoothie, where you can't really tell anymore what came from where because it's all mixed up together. And so in this example, it's an adaptation. It's a remix or an adaptation rather than a collection. But this is where you get into some more kind of gray areas legally. And in a way, I don't think you need to worry about this at the moment, right? I'm just sort of saying to you, this is like the kind of the bit where it gets most complicated. But if you're, moving down the road of OER and you're trying to use different things from different places, these are the kind of things that you might need to be aware of. Most of the time, you're just going to be, producing your own stuff most likely, or finding things that are out there and reusing it. But there is a tool that can help you to understand what you can and can't do based on what the original license is like in terms of remixing. So you can see here the top row is public domain and it's all green. You can do what you like with public domain. CC BY is the most permissive after that. And then the yellow areas are areas where Creative Commons, it says it's possible to do this, but it's not recommended. And then gray is obviously not permitted at all. So this is a useful way if you're trying to work out what you can and can't do with some of these things. So another chart here shows you which licenses are compatible with other licenses. I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but it can be, again, helpful when you're trying to work out what you can and can't do with a particular resource, because you can just look up on the grid the license and which other licenses it's compatible with and what you can and can't do with it. Here's another example, which I think is maybe a bit easier to read. This shows you what you can do with the different licenses. Obviously, you can copy and publish anything. And then depending on the license, you can and can't do certain things. And they're ordered here in terms of like most open at the top and least open at the bottom, you could say. But they're all open licenses. I think the point here is it's a bit technical, right? But it's not unclear. If you spend a bit of time, don't really have enough time to go into it in a way today. It's also worth bearing in mind, only the copyright holder can apply an open license to something. And if someone doesn't meet the terms that you set with your open license, that's a copyright violation. So that's how it kind of relates back to the original copyright. There is a protocol to help you when you're offering attribution, which is known as TASL, title, author, source, license. And you can see an example here, and where I've used images and so on, I've used this format, except public domain, which you don't have to. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about innovation a little bit more. Um, One thing to say about innovation, which I've mentioned a few times already, it's very contextual. So what counts as innovation is often going to be quite influenced by your context and the particular problems that you're trying to address, whether it's an issue of access or technology or whatever. Um, and so it's worth thinking about that, right? There's not one roadmap that you can follow. And just to give some examples here from some of the projects I mentioned at the start, for UK open textbooks, for instance, people replacing textbooks with openly licensed equivalents, and we found examples of how they've been innovating relating to that. In the BizMOOC project, we had examples of people using MOOCs, massive open online courses for business training. And the OER world map, we saw people using open licenses to facilitate the flow of information between different open education communities and so on. And, there's lots of different ways. If you think, in a way, the OER is just a container for whatever you're trying to do, right? But because you can share it differently, you can do different kind of things with it. And we found in a project I worked on a few years ago now, we did a bit of detailed follow-up with people about the longer term innovation impact of using OER and found evidence there that there's an ongoing change in culture that can result from shifting towards openness and open practice. You might find it interesting to know that, so this is the diffusion of innovations curve from Rogers. This is an influential theory around innovation. You've got this standard distribution curve in the middle, and this reflects the proportion of people who are adopting something. At the moment, in the USA, which is the most developed market for OER, it's about 5% coverage, which is pretty significant, really. And also indicates that if you follow this idea or this theory, then it can be very soon we should be seeing much more widespread adoption of OER. And this can support this idea of, you start off not really changing much about your practice, but you shift towards using open resources. And then gradually you become more and more invested in the idea of being innovative in what you're doing and rethinking how you're approaching these pedagogical scenarios. Using the SAMR framework, which substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition, this is a framework of technology acceptance. And just to give you the example of open textbooks, you can start off by just using them exactly the same way as the proprietary textbook was being used. But because it's openly licensed, you can do new things. You can share it in different ways. You can add new content when you need to and that kind of thing. You can collaborate with people you couldn't collaborate with before. Don't need a publisher involved and so on. And you can even end up rethinking the whole idea of using a textbook, because why is there a textbook in the first place other than that made sense when you were printing stuff? And so you can understand OER as leading to more and more innovative practice. If you're interested, there's a report from a project I worked on recently. This is for European Network for Catalyzing Open Resources in Education. And there are 49 examples in here from around the world of people using OER to innovate in different ways. And there's also a framework that you can use for evaluating innovation in your own practice included there. So I'm aware we're kind of getting towards the end of the allocated time, and I want to leave some time for discussion, but let me just kind of progress to the end of the slides here. What kind of challenges are associated with this stuff? This is from 2012 and reflects, I think, where we were at the time with this. Uncertainty about how it's supposed to work in practice. Some concerns about the quality levels of OER, because if anyone can produce them, how do we know that they're reliable and that kind of thing? Also issues around, setting the right policy context, setting the expectations of different stakeholders, these kind of things. So now I would say one issue is like finding the OER that's relevant to you can still be an issue. And that depends on where you are. It depends what language that you're working in. The quality issue overall, though, is pretty much not really a thing anymore. And you can see the evidence of that in the UNESCO declaration. No, they're not worried about the quality of these resources. But historically, that's been an issue. I think the complexity of some of this stuff from an intellectual property point of view and a legal point of view can be a bit scary, right? And people are a bit worried, like, I don't want to be in violation of copyright. Maybe I'll just do nothing, right? Because it's a bit concerning. And so that can still be a bit of a barrier. And there's also a kind of initial investment of time and energy to us just to understand all this stuff and get on top of the process and start to understand how it works. There's also an issue, I guess, around access to technology and the internet. Not everyone can access these resources, even when they're so-called open, and that's worth bearing in mind. But for all of these things, you can sort of understand that there's a route to solving them through openness and through collaboration, flexibility, more training, more democratic power structures, more trust, and so on. So openness also provides a kind of a way to address some of these things. So next steps, what happens? How do you become more open in what you're doing? So first suggestion, review some OER, find some OER, have a look at it. Is there something that you could use that could apply to your own context? Think about how you create or share educational resources and think about what does an open version of this look like? It could be that you involve different people as well as just what license you use. Understanding the license options is pretty essential because it gives you the power to make these decisions about what happens with your content. So try just producing something. I asked at the start, kind of, what are you producing? What have you got to share? Could be a lesson plan, could be a handout, whatever. Try putting an open license on it. Also, try raising awareness of OER with other people in your institution and other educators that you know. I've got some examples in here of short courses that you can take. This one's provided by my university, the Open University. And again, this is an openly licensed course, so you can take the content yourself. You can do what you like with it. But you can work your way through it. And I think you get a certificate for completing that one. There's another one. Again, this is from my university, another introduction course. And could find it an interesting comparison to this short session. Here's another example, Kirkwood Community College. OER Up to Speed. The OER Starter Kit. Free book. This is from Washington State University, I think. My Zoom thing's covering my slide. Yeah, Washington State University. So yeah, I strongly recommend having a look at those links when you get the slides and working through some of that stuff on your own. So going back to this question, and we can pick up on this in the discussion, what do you have to share and how could you share it? The key thing is you can apply an open license to anything that you hold the copyright to. Although software, there's special software licenses for being open with. So, but you could still technically put an open license, a CC license on software, but it's not recommended. But what can be an OER? What of these, some of these things you might already be producing them. Lesson plans, handouts, learning materials, reflections, essays, assessments. It could be artworks, infographics, comics, photographs, video content, animations, podcasts, interviews, dialogues, presentation slides like this one, which is also openly licensed, and you're free to use it as an OER. So there's all kinds of things that you may be producing already or could produce that could be OER. How do you share OER? Well, you can share them just the way that you share things now, communities of practice. It could be that your intranet or a bigger repository. It could be a website. It could be a Dropbox, Google Drive. Could be on YouTube, social media, all kinds of ways that people can share. But these are the key questions that you need to be aware of. How might it change your own workflow? How might you adopt different pedagogical practices around the use of OER? How are you going to make sure that OER is designed so that it can be reused and so that it's accessible to others? Where can you put it so that other people can find it? And can you be more innovative as a result of using OER? I think these are important questions. And in a way, you need to sort of have the time to go further into OER to really kind of understand those. But that's the end of my slides. That's the end of my formal presentation. I hope you found it interesting. There's a lot of information in there. And I think we've got about 15 minutes left where we can have a bit of a discussion, and I'll pick up on some of the things from the chat as well. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and yeah, let's have a bit of a conversation about it.
Thank you so much, Robert. A lot to learn about open education resources as well as copyright. So just before opening the floor to all the participants, there are some questions from the chat. And for that, from Daiva, Adam, and Fernando, their questions is mainly related to reliability and how to identify valuable resources, which you also covered during your presentation. If you could explain a bit more. And for the questions on for specific questions from Alenka, Nurbiha, and Daniel, I think it's better if you raise the questions and clarify a bit more.
Okay. Okay, great. So in terms of liability, so if you're the creator of something, and you're the author, then it's your copyright. Okay, so you can't violate your own copyright. Where you get into potential difficulty is if someone's released something on an open license, which you then don't obey the rule that they've set. So for instance, if someone releases something on an open license and it includes a non-commercial clause, and you disregard that and say, okay, well, I'm just going to take it and I'm going to start charging people money to access it, that's where you become liable, right? You're now in violation of copyright because you didn't abide by the conditions of the open license. So the open licenses are legally enforceable. It's not just the kind of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't make money off my content? If someone does that, they're liable for copyright violation. But if you're just dealing with your own content and it is stuff that you've written yourself, it's very hard to make yourself liable for anything because it's your own copyright. You're the only person that could sue yourself, if I can put it that way. Where it gets a bit trickier is if you say, okay, well, here's a load of stuff that's online, and someone else, was a bit in a way, like the licenses are quite clear in terms of what you can and can't do. So if you understand what the licenses mean and you follow what the licenses mean, it's very hard to see that you would be in any sort of legal trouble. Certainly, it's a better situation than fair use, which is much more a gray area, and it's much easier to kind of, risk violating copyright if you were just saying, well, it's fair use, and someone says, well, it's not fair use because you've reproduced half my book as photocopies or something, which I've certainly seen in universities. So yeah, I think you can always check with Creative Commons as well about what you want to do and say, does the license permit this? And that's another way to protect yourself. But I've never known anything like this be an issue, to be honest. Okay, there were some other questions, right? You'll have to remind me of the names.
Yes, of course. May I invite first Daniel and then Fernando, Alenka, Nurbiha. So we will go one by one. First, Daniel.
Hello, thank you, Rob, for the presentation. You gave me a lot of good ideas, but my question is related to artificial intelligence tools that we are making new pictures and new tests. And how can we manage these licenses? Can I make my own licenses for tests generated by ChatGPT or so on? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. And I did have some slides on this, but I took out because I thought it was getting a bit too long. But basically, this is a gray area legally, and we're waiting for more case law. But at the moment, there are judgments already from the US which says that what comes out of a GPT cannot be copyrighted because it has no author. It's a mechanical output. And so what that means is it's assumed to be in the public domain. And that's why it's like, people share all these kind of Mid-Journey images or ChatGPT things shared online freely. It's assumed to be in the public domain, but there are some pretty strong arguments to say that there's copyright violation happening, right? Because if you look at the people who make these GPTs, they don't care where it comes from, right? So they're taking stuff off YouTube, they're taking things from people's websites, they just don't care at all. So at some point, I think the law is going to catch up on that. At the moment, there's no reason to say that you can't do anything you like with what comes out of a chat GPT or Mid-Journey or whatever it might be, Sora, you know. So, but I would just say be cautious, because the law eventually will probably change in some way. But you could argue, why do we need OERs, right? We'll just use ChatGPT to create stuff, and then, but obviously it's not reliable, and it's also quite bad at some things that you think it would be good at. So a little bit of caution. At the moment, my understanding is it's assumed to be in the public domain, whatever comes out of it. But as they're training on copyrighted materials, there's obviously an issue, attention, let's say, at least. And it's not even so simple as saying, but we'll just train things on open materials, because GPTs can't give attribution correctly, right? So that you couldn't abide by the open license. So yeah, there's all kinds of like interesting issues around that. I would say tread carefully in terms of using GPTs, even though at the moment there's no reason not to. I just think in some ways it can be a useful tool. It can be something that helps you create stuff. But the idea of just, oh, I'll just get ChatGPT to write something and then I'll put an open license on it. I mean, technically you don't need an open license because it's public domain, but that could change, I guess, is my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Daniel. Before I go to the next question, I think Fernando's question is a bit related to Daniel's as well. It's related to the resources generated by ChatGPT AI. But Fernando, if what Robert just now explained, if it didn't answer your questions, completely, you can reframe and ask the question. Robert, may I request you to include the slides that you have removed on AI and ChatGPT? Seems like there are a lot of interest in this area. Then we can share the slides with the participants. Fernando? Okay, Fernando is not here, but his question was similar to Daniel's as well. He wanted to know mainly how open education resources deal with this kind of changes where new resources are generated. And Alenka, may I invite you to, yes.
Hello. So another gray area, probably. We've had, a couple of years ago, we had school reform, which enabled us to create our own lesson plans and curricula for different subjects. And I was really excited because this opens a lot of space for using OERs and sharing. And then at the end of the whole 1 year of studying about making new curricula and everything else, we were forced to choose certain books approved by the state, textbooks, which are then very limiting, because we have to choose certain textbooks for certain subjects, and we cannot change it for 4 years, let's say. And those textbooks, because the publishers have their own goals, they're usually mixed with it's not the textbook, the classical textbook, but it has all kinds of let's say types of exercises and online resources and everything else, but they push you in a certain channel where your creativity is very limited. And I've noticed also that students really, when you say textbook, they are not very happy about it. So on one hand, our state of Croatia gives us free hands, let's say, and then imposes the choice of textbooks and limits our freedom. I would like really to know other experiences and how to overcome, because I feel sometimes that I'm in a gray area when I want to use something else other than what was imposed by the state. So.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question, and in some ways, the template here is provided by the USA. obviously it depends on where you are and what the different pressures are. One of the reasons why OER has become quite a big thing in the USA is because the curriculum is set at the state level. So the textbooks are all related back to like at the state level. So there's very, very big markets for these textbooks, and they're often very expensive. And so one of the original kind of ideas that people had was, we need to bring the cost of these textbooks down as much as possible. And in a way that started the arguments around advocacy and, you know, institutional change and that kind of thing. And then it was only later on that people started thinking, oh, actually, but we can also do new things now with these resources. Now that we've got OERs into the system, if you like, and people are more comfortable with the whole concept of an openly licensed versus copyrighted textbook. But now they're in the system, people start to think, oh, what else can we do with these things? So in some ways, there's a kind of issue of just advocacy, right? How do you get people even talking about OER in the first place? And that looks different in different places. And the problem that you're trying to solve can be different in different places. So it partly depends on what's needed in your context. And so one way to approach it is to say, what issues do we have? And then start thinking, how can OER support that or be part of the solution to that? It might be that it's not in the classroom at first, right? It might be that it's something else at first. I don't know. Could be done on a research basis or something like that. But once you start people, like the main barrier to all this stuff is awareness. Once people understand what an OER is and what you can do with it, it becomes a bit less scary and a bit, you know, a bit more easy to see what's possible. So you have to work within the constraints that exist for you. And if you have very little control over the curriculum, one way to approach it would be to say, okay, we just concentrate on producing extra materials. So it's not part of the curriculum, but it's extra stuff that people can use. Maybe there's video content or extra quizzes or, you know, whatever it might be, but that's all openly licensed. And so you get it into the system. You get people starting to use these things, and you think about later on, that's when you start to change the curriculum, when in a way you've proved the concept already, something like that. But yeah, it's very contextual. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Looking at the time, we can only take one question, so I invite Nurbiha. And thanks, Robert, for responding to pretty much all the questions in the chat box. Nurbiha?
Thank you, Jyoti. Hi, Robert. My question is actually quite direct, because it seems like and BY and ND kind of material we cannot make money from that. I just need some clarification again. So if a material is BY and ND, that means we can make money from it as long as it has no NC, non-commercial symbols on that material, isn't it?
Yeah. So the NC is just relates to whether you can use it commercially or not. No, ND is no derivatives, so you can't change it. You can't readapt it or remix it and that kind of thing. So you might have an ND clause, but no NC clause. That means basically you can just take the thing as it is and redistribute it, and you can try and make money off it, for instance. So if I take the works of Shakespeare and I print them into a new book, I can sell the book, right? It does get a bit more interesting when you say, well, what is commercial use, right? We're using a very clear idea of like, oh, so I'm selling the content. But what if you said, no, I don't sell the content, but I have a business where I'm a consultant and I use OER to support my consultancy? Well, that's kind of a gray area, right? Because you're still using it to support making money, even if you're not making money off the resource itself. So you can get into some gray areas like that. But generally speaking, unless you're making a huge amount of money from something, no one's really going to be that bothered, right? About, you know, like, and also you could say, well, if I just cover my own costs, so I just cover the cost of printing and I don't make any money myself, is that commercial use? I mean, it's debatable, right? There's no profit. So, but in practice, I think, you know, you can often always also check with the original creator because you know who they are, right? And you can just write to them and say, is it okay with you if we do this? And if they say yes, then it's fine, you know. But generally speaking, if someone hasn't put a non-commercial clause on it, it's safe to assume that you can do what you want in terms of profitability. So yeah, but but you can always check with the original creator and just make sure that they're okay with it. That's my suggestion.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nurbiha. Finally, a big thank you to Robert for such an insightful and informative presentations on open education resources. Hopefully it helped you to understand the topic better. And thank you to those of you who are actively ask questions. If you still have any burning questions, please do send them to us at ClassNet email, and then we will share them with Robert so that he can respond to you in writing. And so again, thank you, Robert. And with this, next time when we meet, we will have the knowledge building session 2 on key concepts and frameworks on artificial intelligence and education by Ms. Sopio. Some of you who have been in Slovenia met her already. She conducted a workshop, so you will meet her again during next session. And with that, thank you very much. Have a lovely day in Europe and a lovely evening in Asia. And also we will be actively sharing our sessions and information that are shared during the session to social media channels. So please actively participate. You can reshare the post so that other people are aware in your network are aware of the lessons learned during our program as well. With that, see you next time. Bye-bye.